Welcome to Liz Collin Reports. On the podcast, a California nurse turned courageous whistleblower, telling the truth about COVID. Gail McCrae is my guest. She's here to talk about hospital corruption, from protocols to vaccine side effects, and her new fight in court. Gail, thank you so much for being my guest. Appreciate you being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to try and inspire courage in the world around us. That seems to be the trend I've seen the last 2-3 years now is, it's been a lot of practitioners with very little courage.
I think you're doing just that, inspiring courage, but by sharing your story. And just first of all, let's start with your background as a nurse. I know this was work you were very passionate about. When did you become a nurse? And explain for our listeners, for our viewers, where you worked.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in California. I went to nursing school and graduated in 2011. From there, I went directly into hospital-based nursing. I worked in ICU for several years, and then I specialized most of my career in telemetry, which is cardiac, heart-related abnormalities, heart attacks and strokes and such. My passion was always babies, so I ended up moving to Africa in 2015 and working in a rural district teaching hospital there for a year, delivering babies and learning how to practice the art of midwifery. And so when I returned from that, I had a couple of my own kids. And then when my youngest daughter was 2.5, I started graduate school to become a nurse practitioner as a certified nurse midwife. And women's health was the specialty. So, but throughout that time, I had always spent my career in the hospital. And most of that was in telemetry and cardiac floors.
So specifically, you are spending some time at the Kaiser Permanente Hospital around the Bay Area. Is that right?
Yeah, so I worked for Kaiser Santa Rosa starting in 2015, and then they fired me in October of 2021 for refusing to fill out a religious exemption and or take the COVID shots. So
we'll get to that in a bit. I wanted to talk about then when the pandemic settles in the spring of 2020. Gail, what are you noticing at the hospital where you work at the time?
Yeah, it was kind of surprising to me right off the bat. There was a lot. I didn't really watch TV at home. And so when I go to the hospital and I was in my patients' rooms, I would see the TV and I would see the news. And I was right away very surprised by what I was seeing because in, March of 2020, when they decided to lock down the communities in preparation, throughout that whole next several months, I witnessed the media saying that our hospitals were full of patients, and they were never full of patients. As a matter of fact, from the onset of COVID, for the whole first year of this pandemic, not only was our hospital under capacity, I was getting canceled. So the position I worked was per diem, so I could choose to schedule myself when I wanted to, and I could accept cancellation anytime the hospital didn't have enough patients to staff me. And since I was in graduate school, I went ahead and took those cuts. And so that went through the whole first winter of 2020 and 2021. We had a standard winter. So this is how it works in the hospital. You know, the hospitals are empty during the summer months, and then they fill up usually once or twice in the winter. That's normal. And that's what happened in the winter of 2020 and 2021. We filled up twice. It was nothing outside the normal.
And let's talk treatment when it comes to COVID patients specifically. When they do come to the hospital, there, of course, was this very specific protocol you were following. What was it that came to serious COVID patients and what you were seeing happen bothered you? It's fair to say, Gail.
Yeah, so the first thing that bothered me was the media coverage. The second thing that bothered me was the protocols. Right off the bat with the shutdowns of everything, they stopped allowing patient family members to the bedside. The first time I had to speak with a family member and tell them they couldn't come to the bedside of their terrified, very sick loved one, that was probably one of the most terrible moments of my life. I felt like I was violating myself, my ethics, my oath, and my patience. I just couldn't stop imagining, if that was me in that position. I felt like a horrible person. I went home then feeling horrible. And then it was the remdesivir. And it was the same thing with the remdesivir that I hear it all around me nowadays, and I heard it from day one. We would sit at the nurse's station and we would talk about, well, why are we giving patients an antiviral when they're a week past symptom onset? Why are we giving them this antiviral medication that's experimental, and we're seeing no improvement? And as a matter of fact, we're seeing patients go into multi-organ failures. And I did bring that up. We spoke about it at the nurses station. We did bring it up to our colleagues, and it was always the same response. This is protocol. This is all we have. There's nothing else we can give. And that was just terrible. It was terrible.
And I know that that's helped you bring this story forward as well, because this is the protocol that still remains in place to this day at most hospitals across the country. This is still protocol, Gail.
It is, and it's extraordinary, especially now that we're seeing the research come out on it. I know that some of the research, there's a lot of holes in a lot of the research. I find a lot of incentivization in a lot of the research. It can't be trusted, but there is research that is coming forward showing the high morbidity and mortality rates with the use of remdesivir. And I've seen major health organizations, the WHO specifically, they put out a statement that they don't recommend it being used, and yet we're still using it on our protocols. I don't understand.
And when do you discover this monetary connection to all of this, Gail? These connections to the protocols, these kickbacks hospitals are receiving?
I didn't really find out too much about that until probably the summer of 2021, when I was getting closer to throwing the towel in on my medical field work that I'd spent my whole life doing. We have a hard time imagining that terrible things are happening. And we really do go to lengths to trust these three-letter agencies that, are setting protocols like the CDC and the WHO and the AMA. That's really what it comes down to, I think, is that there are so many practitioners that are genuinely good people, and they just can't imagine that these terrible things are happening.
I think it's difficult for the public to grasp that as well. You want to think that your best interest as a patient is really at heart. But you said something to me that struck me right away before we had this conversation, and that was this, that I was participating in medical murder. That's what you told me, but you truly believe that?
I absolutely do. And again, I think that it comes from the combination. It's the remdesivir, it's the isolation of the patients, it's weeks on end with no access to food and water. I'm not sure how much of that is still going on, because since I was fired, I haven't put another foot back into the medical field, and I don't plan to. But all of these protocols, the fear-mongering, the isolation, the toxic medications, I walked away feeling like I had participated in medical murder. And in addition to that, I'm still processing it. In addition to that, what I saw with the injections really just drove it home. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk more about that because it is so eye-opening to hear your story when it comes to the injection. And you make a point to not call it a vaccine, of course, but explain why that is.
Yeah, so while I talked you through the timeline of how the hospitals were empty the first year of COVID. Well, starting in March of 2021, that was right around the time when they provided those injections to our community. The healthcare workers all got them first, and then starting in late February, early March, my community got access to the gene therapy injections. And within 2 weeks of the onset of the vaccination of our community with these experimental shots, my hospital filled to 3 times higher hospital admissions than they've ever had since the hospital opened their doors. And that was reported to me by the administrators and management at my hospital. I went to work one day in June, and one of my direct managers looked at me, and he said that he'd been evaluating the records, and he had seen that we had 3 times higher admissions. That was after I had already experienced 3.5 months of our staffing department calling me 3 times a day, every day, to come to work. So, and then when I did go, there were some other interesting things that happened. So I worked as a nurse for about 10 years, and I noticed in about June of 2021, I worked a double. It was right around that same time my manager approached me and told me that. And I worked on 2 different units during that 16 hours because they were so desperate for nurses. And I was working as a patient care coordinator on both units that I worked on. And what that means is that I got report on every patient on both units. So I got report on probably 55 or 60 patients in those 16 hours. And every single one of those patients that was admitted into the hospital during that time was there for a heart attack, a stroke, a weird peripheral clotting disorder. 4 of those patients had rapid onset Guillain-Barré. 2 of them I talked to directly said that it happened directly in correlation with their jab. The other 2 I didn't get a chance to ask. But it became extraordinarily clear to me that those were side effects from these injections. And in addition to that, during that 2-week period in June, when I was working, I noticed a massive increase in code blues. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, explain that.
So
this is something that you normally don't hear in a hospital.
Correct. So a code blue, that we call code blues on the overhead comm in the hospital, and it happens usually on average about once a shift for the first 9 years I was in the field. And then starting in about March, I noticed an uptick in code blues. And the interesting thing about this is that in our hospital, Kaiser Permanente is a fully inclusive medical care facility. So they do labs, medications. It's a hospital. They have their clinics. They have an urgent care clinic. And oddly enough, the COVID vaccination clinic was taking place on the lower level of the main hospital. So they would call code blues in the overhead comm throughout the whole hospital, and 9 out of 10 times those code blues were to the lower level down to the clinic where they were injecting people. And two of my colleagues did in fact go into anaphylaxis in addition after receiving their shots. So not only did I hear it through the overhead comms, but I also had colleagues who I knew personally who went into anaphylaxis.
But from what I understand, Gail, you're seeing this play out before your eyes and in your hospital, but you're told that you're not allowed to report this.
Yeah, that's correct. And it wasn't just me that was told that. So it was kind of just understood that we weren't allowed to report anything. Nobody talked about reporting it. And if we did, we would get a head shake and they would say, no, we can't prove that this is from the injections. It was very hush hush. But in addition to that, one of my colleagues, she won't unfortunately come forward, but she did report to me. She was the main COVID injection clinic nurse. So she went to work 9 to 5 administering these shots. And she witnessed, I believe she said, between 3 and 10 episodes of anaphylaxis per shift at the beginning when she was administering them. And she did directly ask her manager about reporting those events. And her manager directly told her that if she reported a single adverse event, she would be fired. So, and there were other cases like that were similar. It also happened with the reporting of fully vaccinated patients and staff who came in with COVID. We were not allowed to report those cases. So we had charting system glitches where the charts would only allow us to insert that the patients were unvaccinated or that their vaccination status was unknown. That took place for a few months. I don't think it's still going on, but when the media was reporting that all of the patients who were admitted to the hospital were unvaccinated, that was never true. I was working on those COVID floors, taking care of those patients. That came down to the charting system that we were using to tally up that evidence, and how it intentionally excluded fully vaccinated status in the charting systems.
Well, and you've talked about that before too. The definition on several things had been changed.
Yeah, so that's part of it too. Is that they wouldn't record, if they hadn't received their vaccine, more than 2 weeks ago, we couldn't count this as as a potential COVID case because the vaccine still hadn't taken effect yet. So they manipulated it in multiple ways.
And we now know that the CDC has only recently acknowledged some of these side effects, years later. But you were seeing this early on, and ultimately you ended up being fired due to the federal mandate that you had to get the shot. Just talk about what your life was like after that.
Right out the gate, we were noticing those extreme side effects from those shots. It was really unprecedented. The last thing I'll say about that is that, those were summer months. That was March to June. And, I looked around me at my colleagues and I saw them just, the cognitive dissonance. Just, I would say, like, aren't you guys seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? And they would say it privately. We had little group meetings where there was a support group that I attended. There was about 120 community members that were part of that group. And we would talk about it there, but it was so locked down in the hospital. The staff were just afraid of losing their jobs. Really, I think that's what it came down to: their mortgages, their children, their livelihoods. So it was really terrible. But luckily for me, I had my husband, he was a civil engineer. We had a decent income, and I wasn't extremely reliant on my paycheck. And so I do definitely have to admit, it played a role in my ability to exercise courage. I'd also had, a much more diverse background than a lot of people as far as living in a third world country like Africa for a year. It teaches you a few things about courage. And, when it's worth it to stand up and say something. And so that definitely played a big role. But, I was fired for refusing even to take the religious exemption route. I submitted legal documents to my employer, and they put me on leave and then fired me 5 days later. So I'm not going to give up.
And I know you're Yeah, well, and I want to talk about what you're doing now. Your courage certainly continues with Stand Firm Now. The website is standfirmnow.org. But explain the mission here.
Yeah, so, I've been involved in multiple lawsuits since I left the medical field. When it happened, I thought, gosh, how is this happening? How can they fire me for refusing an experimental use authorization? Because we're protected at state, federal, and international levels with statutes and laws over the mandate of an experimental use authorization. And what I discovered was, wow, there's a lot of contracts that I've signed that have, where I've given up my constitutional rights, and I've opted in to these things. And so we find ourselves going to court and having no leg to stand on because of different, things that we've done in the past to kind of set us up to not be able to exercise our constitutional rights. And so this project, standfirmnow.org, we've created a legal affidavit in order to set precedents. We have an attorney. He is going to use a legal tactic called a negative averment to assert evidence into the courts. And what we're trying to do is basically compile so much expert witness testimony. Experts, that's doctors, nurses, scientists, people with scientific knowledge, background, and understanding, not necessarily that have had experiences, because it's really more about your standing as an expert and having that background and education to be able to state that the things in the document are true and correct. It's a really straightforward document. It's on the website. You can go and look at it. I think most people would feel comfortable signing it. It's backed up by over 320 exhibits, which are also on the website. So we've kind of tried to do everything for people to make this easy, because we know that everyone is busy. I think what it comes down to is, who's got the courage to come forward and do it, because it's asking people to put their name on a legal document. And, that's really what it comes down to for me at the end of the day. It's like, well, I'm passing this world on to my children, and that's why I'm doing this, is because my children are coming into this world after me. And if I don't show them what it looks like to exercise courage, they might end up making bad choices for themselves.
I know you get a lot of these questions now as an expert in all of this, but if someone died of COVID in a hospital during all of this and they have questions, what do you recommend? What should they do?
That's a great question, because, COVID definitely, it's not harmless. It causes massive inflammation. And I think, as a matter of fact, that's the number one reason why we had so many COVID deaths. It was a combination of the administration of remdesivir, the isolation in the hospitals, and not addressing the massive inflammatory process that occurs when you get COVID. So that's the first thing that I think people really need to understand. You need to address the inflammation. High dose steroids, or alternatives to that would be like NAC and glutathione. Those also really help to address inflammation. Turmeric and curcumin, those help address the coagulopathies associated with COVID, as well as the inflammation. Melatonin is a great tool. They've found it competes with the binding site of the spike protein. And then, of course, zinc, vitamin D, and C. At home, I'll take quercetin. That's a natural antiviral. So I keep all of those things in my cupboard.
And if people have questions about something that perhaps happened to their loved one, you really do have to start, though, with the medical records, Gail.
Absolutely. And there's several websites for this too. The FLCCC has great resources for people who have gotten COVID. They have doctors who can write prescriptions. There's also the Former Feds group. They are a mass group of victims of medical murder. People like myself, I'm the practitioner, but the victims, the family members who watched all these things, terrible things happen to their family members. There are places to go to get resources, and I definitely recommend that people start coming together and talking to each other and taking action to, try to bring some awareness and accountability.
What has it been like for you to take this big step forward and speak up?
That's a great question, and I love answering it because, a lot of people come to me and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry that you lost all these things. And, to be honest, I feel that I've gained far more than I've lost, because even though I'm not getting that great paycheck, I am doing what I think and feel is right in my heart and my soul. And when I stand up for my own self and my integrity and the rights of myself and my children and the people around me, it's really kind of communicated to me, well, what is the purpose of life? Am I here to make a paycheck or to make ends meet? Or am I here to, stand up for myself and engage, with love? Ultimately, for me, really, this all comes down to making decisions out of a place of extraordinary love and compassion for the world around me. And that's what this has given me the opportunity to do. So I'm honestly very grateful to be out of the hospital and to be here advocating for things that I find to be, of justice and moral grounds.
Yeah, acting in ethics and morals, something we don't see much of, it seems like, these days, Gail.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for all the time you spent talking with me and just for telling the truth and being my guest today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Again, Gail McCrae. And that will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.